Well, good evening, and welcome to the sixth event in this year's Humanities Lecture Series. I'm Victor Bailey, Director of the Hall Centre, which organises the event. It's our great pleasure this evening to bring you Michael Ignatieff. Our speaker will take questions after his talk. If you would make your way to one of the two microphones. We are recording the event, and we would like your question on the record. Afterwards, in the lobby, there will be a reception where Professor Ignatieff will sign copies of a few of his many books. Please stay with us for that. At this point, I traditionally tell you who I asked to introduce our guest speaker. Well, tonight, I chose myself. So I'll stay and do the introduction. It's my considerable pleasure to introduce Michael Ignatieff, a Canadian of many parts, historian, journalist, philosopher, broadcaster, novelist, and if this were not enough, politician. He's a writer of enormous versatility in both subject and genre. He's currently the Edward R. Murrow Professor of Practice at Harvard's Kennedy School, where he teaches classes on human rights, foreign policy, and the demands of political life. His career to this point has gone through a number of metamorphoses. He's an historian by training with a Harvard PhD. His first book was A Just Measure of Pain, The Penitentiary in the Industrial Revolution, 1978. A book rightly spoken of in the same breath as Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, though the two books have a different sensibility to historical evidence and offer different causative emphases. It was in the old Public Record Office in Chancery Lane, London, where I first met Michael in the early 1970s, working on this history. He was already an impressive thinker and a supportive research colleague. Teaching and research appointments at the University of British Columbia in Canada and King's College, Cambridge in England in the later 1970s were followed by the bold decision to live by his wits as freelance writer, journalist, and broadcaster for 15 years in London. He jumped from the ivory tower and landed in what the English call Grub Street. Though this pejorative term for impoverished hack writers of low literary value does less than justice to Michael's wonderful run in London. They were extremely productive years. In 1984, there appeared The Needs of Strangers, a philosophical text on that third word in the national motto of France, fraternity or solidarity. The book examined the extent to which we can achieve fraternity and the costs of doing so. The Russian album followed in 1987, a history of his ancestors in 19th century Russia and later exile to Canada. Michael is the great-grandson of Count Nikolai Ignatieff and grandson of Count Paul Ignatieff, both of whom served as cabinet ministers in imperial Russian governments. His father, George, an émigré aristocrat, became an eminent Canadian diplomat. The Russian album won the 1987 Governor-General's Award for Nonfiction, one of Canada's highest literary awards. His documentary series, Blood and Belonging, Journeys into the New Nationalism, aired on BBC in 1993 with a book of the same title. It was a meditation on the dangers of ethnic nationalism in the post-Cold War era, with the forewarning that ethnic nationalism brings both belonging and bloodshed. In the same year, he wrote Scar Tissue, a novel exploring the disintegration of a mother due to neurological disease, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, no less. In 1998, he wrote an acclaimed biography of Isaiah Berlin, an interview-based portrait of the modern philosopher who, above all, affirmed pluralism the superiority of colliding values and tolerance over the absolute certainties of totalitarian ideologies. Across the same years, Michael became well known as a telegenic presenter of arts programs on television and radio, with a style and mannerisms distinctive enough to become the butt of cruel English satire. He was also an editorial columnist for The Observer. In 2000, a new phase of his career opened when appointed as director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. The books continued to emerge. Human Rights as Politics and Idolatry, based on the 2000 Tanner Lectures at Princeton's Center for Human Values, examined that human rights revolution, a revolution that brought the world moral progress, but faced challenges from nation states jealous of their sovereignty. Virtual War, Kosovo and Beyond won the Orwell Prize for Political Nonfiction in 2001. An analysis of conflict in Kosovo, the book wonders if virtual wars conducted from high in the skies will become the way superpowers will now impose their will. The Lesser Evil, Political Ethics in an Age of Terror, based on the 2003 Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh, pondered how to win the war against terror without losing our democratic souls. In the first years of this century, then, Michael became one of the most influential voices in the global debate on human rights and on the international responsibilities of Western nations. He has adopted an interventionist approach, even to the point of supporting the 2003 invasion of Iraq, a position he later recanted. He helped prepare the report, The Responsibility to Protect, for the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, a report that examined the role of international involvement in Kosovo and Rwanda and advocated a framework for intervention in future humanitarian crises. By 2005, he was being listed by Foreign Policy magazine as among the 100 most influential public intellectuals in the world. In 2006, he went from being political spectator to being political actor, elected as a Toronto Member of Parliament, this as preface to assuming the leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada and leader of the opposition from 2008 to 2011. He describes his career in politics as, and I quote, nasty, brutish, and short. In the 2011 general election, the Liberal Party crashed and burned, a metaphor that finds an echo in his subsequent reflection on this experience, fire and ashes, success and failure in politics. No question, it was a bruising electoral defeat. But few scholars would have had the courage to fly so close to the sun, the courage to climb the greasy pole of politics. I give you, therefore, a remarkable scholar whose theme tonight is the better angels of our nature. Do human beings make moral progress? Please welcome my very good friend, Professor Michael Ignatieff.
After that introduction, all that remains is to attach the blindfold. It's very kind of you, Vic, and I remember our beginnings together in the Public Record Office with great affection, and Kansas is lucky to have this guy, so it's a great pleasure to be here. I've chosen a preposterously ambitious title. I know how preposterous it is, but occasionally I think it's good in what we do to stand back and ask a big, impossible question, because it can lead us to some interesting reflections. I am got a talk to give you. I've got a few slides, but I promise they're very few. My wife says that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So there'll be some slides to help us along, but there won't be too many, I promise. Okay, the question, do human beings make moral progress, is one of these vast questions that started in the 18th century and has never gone away. It's been asked since the dawn of the European Enlightenment by great figures like Giambattista Vico, Adam Smith, the Marquis de Condorcet, and they invented the idea of progress essentially because they felt the tremors of economic development and change beneath their feet, and they understood that history was accelerating into a new kind of rhythm. And the old stories about time, stories that it stood still till the last judgment when everything would be changed in the twinkling of an eye, or the older classical idea that time was a cycle of eternal recurrence, always returning to the same spot. Those old ideas of time no longer seem to make sense of what they could see, which was economic advance, the voyages of discovery, the new inventions, the rapid growth of cities. Progress was the new idea that gave meaning to time. And the Enlightenment claim, first articulated by Vico, was that human history had a meaning because we made it. Human history was something we did, not God, not the Lord, but us. And because we had made it, we could understand it. And we made history not necessarily as we intended, but in a manner that served human purposes. And those purposes were very simple: to increase our mastery of nature, to reduce human suffering, and to enlarge human freedom. And we made progress, the Enlightenment thinkers believed, because we believed we could. There was an element of progress being dependent on our faith in ourselves. Progress was a wager of faith on man's own dynamism. And so my question tonight is, what remains of this Enlightenment heritage? Most modern day skeptics, most of you would probably not deny that we've made advances in the fields of science and technology, and we have greater mastery of nature. The question about moral progress is whether we've become less brutal, more inclusive, more tolerant over the centuries. That is to say, whether technical and scientific and economic progress is correlated with moral change of any kind. That's the question and I freely grant it's too big a question, too hard a question, but heck, that's what humanities centers are for, am I right? Now, I want to just show you, I want to introduce you to a debate about this question, which will help us to focus. Steven Pinker, a distinguished colleague of mine, is a Harvard psychologist, and he's the latest prominent thinker to take up the Enlightenment task of showing that moral progress is empirically demonstrable. And he's written a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he's marshaled substantial evidence to show that over the last 2 centuries in Europe, we have made what he calls moral progress. And his evidence looks something like this. We have reduced the amount of grotesque physical punishment. Our punishments have become less brutal. People live longer. Wars between states and within states are less ferocious. The number of major countries with torture has declined. Other indices of interpersonal violence are declining. Slavery has gone from being an absolutely common practice nearly to abolition. Countries that discriminate against ethnic minorities, the numbers are going down. Countries with policies favoring ethnic minorities going up. When you ask, have we made moral progress, these are the kinds of indices that you would want to look at. And Professor Pinker was kind enough to share those slides with me so I could present them to you tonight. But this account of human history has been very sharply criticized by another very distinguished philosopher, political philosopher, man I know, man I respect, who used to teach at the London School of Economics, John Gray. And he's entered the lists on the other side of this debate, hammering away at what he calls the myth that progress achieved in science and technology can also occur in ethics, politics, or more generally civilization. He thinks that the idea that science can transform the human lot, that is, transform our ethical behavior, is a form of magic. For Gray, the idea of progress is a dubious search for consolation by technological determinists unwilling to confront the reality that technology and science, far from enabling moral progress, science has made possible many of the most characteristic horrors of the modern age. You cannot think of the mass extermination of the 20th century without thinking of the enabling role of science and technology. This Pinker-Gray debate, which has been conducted in British newspaper skirmishes since 2015, is significant, I think, because it's one of the few occasions recently when anyone in the public realm has dared to ask that old Enlightenment question about the meaning of history. And the debate has added resonance, I think, because I think the times we're living in are the kind of moments when a lot of us think history has lost its plot. This sense that history no longer makes sense has a lot to do, obviously, with the way it's mediated. Journalism brings us most of our world to us, and it brings us mostly bad news. In fact, an unceasing tide of bad news: terrorism, war, floods, and famine. Now, that is what journalism does, and it was ever thus. But I think the thing that is distinctive in the 21st century, perhaps since 9/11, is that feeling that the bad news is assembling into an ominous pattern, an ominous and recurring pattern. In the environment, irreparable harm to the climate system. In the political world, corruption as an endemic, systemic feature. In the economy, instability and meltdown as permanent features of our economic experience. Now, let's not get carried away. Most of us faced with bad news in the public world do what the British call keep calm and carry on. And we're all good at keeping calm and carry on in the face of bad news in the external world. It's a test of our sanity that we do so. But what makes it, I think, a little harder to keep gloom at bay these days is the emerging suspicion that a new arc of meaning is dismantling the old narratives of reassurance. The narratives of reassurance that said free markets and free institutions are going to sweep the world. The narratives of reassurance that said new technologies are going to do nothing but good. They're going to do nothing but beat back hunger and disease. And most of all, that Enlightenment narrative that reason and knowledge will always defeat fanaticism and extremism. It's, in fact, that third narrative that is perhaps the most endangered of all. And in place of these old narratives of reassurance, I think many of us feel a new narrative taking us over, seeping into everyday conversation, a narrative that speaks the language of disintegration, entropy, decline, one that even speaks of civilization being replaced by barbarism. And this is the mental climate which I think shapes the Gray-Pinker debate and makes it plausible for someone like John Gray to accuse Steve Pinker of being an apologist for a system and a way of life, liberal democratic capitalism, that is slowly collapsing from inner disillusion and external attack from authoritarians and fanatics alike. So that's the context of this return of an old Enlightenment debate. And I wanted to take you through this. And in this debate, I'm going to take Steve Pinker's side. I'm going to try and convince you, in fact, that moral progress is a convincing way to understand the history we've lived. But I want to do some with some nuance, because I think some of John Gray's arguments hit home. And so if I'm going to stand up in front of you and defend the idea of moral progress, I'm going to have to kind of chip away at some stuff in the idea of moral progress that I think we need to discard, so we have a credible idea that we can examine and talk about, hopefully, after I finish. First of all, believing in progress doesn't turn you into a blithe optimist. It merely reminds us that our forebears lived through darker times than these, and they fought their way to a better future, and if they can, so can we. It doesn't make you a blithe optimist, it just makes you, in my judgment, a realist. Secondly, a belief in progress doesn't imply that human nature has got a lot better. I think we're stuck with the same old human stuff. And the claim about progress is not that we have rid ourselves of our ordinary vices, but rather that science, technology, and institutions have made it easier for us to practice the ordinary virtues. We haven't changed human nature for the better, but technology and decent institutions have made it easy for us to advance what I think the Enlightenment rightly saw as humanity's enduring purposes. And those purposes are essentially two: reducing the amount of avoidable suffering in human life and expanding the circle of human inclusion. And the Enlightenment understood that those purposes were enduring in human history and we're still on the path, is basically the claim that the idea of progress makes. Accomplishing these purposes has not been easy, and it's not been inevitable. Our successes, such as they are always a work of struggle, and no one has a monopoly on the triumphs that have resulted. So you can believe in progress without becoming an apologist for liberal capitalism in the brief era of American hegemony. Progress has a much longer history than that, and it'll have bearers of progress after this system of government or this brief period of hegemony passes. And nor does progress require you to be an apologist for white European Christian civilization. Again, progress has many more sources than just this one civilization. We're not required to downplay the crimes committed by that civilization, but we ought to give some credit to its achievements, without presuming that this civilization is the only source of the advances that human beings have made. The other thing is that the idea of moral progress does not allow us, or doesn't require us, to forget the tragedy of human life. You can believe in progress without forgetting that life can be hard and brutal and unfair and senseless. You can believe in progress, understanding that life often ends before we want it to, and that those we love are taken from us senselessly. A faith in progress does not retell history as a story with a happy ending. It's a claim about what we've achieved as human beings, not a guarantee of a better future. It's chiefly a conviction that the present is actually better than the past, that we do live in a world where more children survive to adulthood, more women do not die in childbirth, and more people accept in principle, even if they don't practice it very well, that all human beings are equal. The other thing about progress has been linked historically, particularly in the Enlightenment, with a belief that science was superior to religion. But I think believing in progress does not commit us to maintain that scientific rationalism is superior to religious faith. Having seen what secular reason has occasionally done in the 20th century, I think it'd be a good idea to strip the idea of progress from its rationalist hubris. We can believe in moral progress without thinking that it requires us to put religion in its place or drive it out of the public realm. To believe in progress is to be committed to the trial and error of scientific discovery, but it's not committed to the belief that science has grounds to dismiss religion's promise of redemption and consolation. Finally, no idea of moral progress, I think, is committed to the fantasy that human history is always onward and upward. Progress needs to be thought of as stochastic. Let me spell that for you. S-T-O-C-H-A-S-T-I-C. Stochastic. Forward, back, lurches, not continuous onward and upward. In fact, progress must be thought as a push and pull of trial and error, advance and regression. Believing in progress should not exclude the vital role of mistakes in human progress, the vital role of backward sliding, the vital role of missed opportunity in the story of how we got to where we are today. So I've tried to jettison from the idea of progress some of the things that I think made it more difficult to believe in the 21st century. And let me now say what I think you are committed to if you believe in the idea of moral progress. Moral progress is committed to the idea that human history is meaningful. It's not one damn thing after another. John Gray claims that there can be no such thing as a history of humanity, only a history of individual human beings. And that just seems wrong to me. If you think about your own individual lives, you'll very quickly see the extent and degree to which each of you are dependent upon humanity's collective achievements. And let me give you an example. A fountain pen, a spoon, a fork, right? All these things that you take for granted, and we can't even remember who invented them, are part of the collective achievement of humanity that we take for granted every time we eat a meal or write a postcard, if any of us still write postcards. My wife writes postcards. So I think it's coherent to think, therefore, that individual separate lives are beneficiaries of the collective history of humanity in these kind of ways. And the larger claim about progress is that there's a pattern, there's a shape to human achievement. Each advance in its separate ways has contributed, again, to repeat the thought, to two key achievements: reducing the amount of avoidable human suffering and widening the circle of human inclusion. And by widening the circle of human inclusion, I'm saying something very concrete and direct. For centuries, millennia, it was possible for human beings to conceive that another human being was a thing to be bought or sold, to be whipped and beaten. And we have got to a point where we have at least acknowledged finally that human beings, all of them, are human beings. Not bad. That's what I mean. We've widened the circle of inclusion. And we've actually got to the point that no one can be properly excluded from what we call the human race. And there is a consistent shape, therefore, to human achievement over time, because the impulses driving our innovations, driving our struggle, were primordial and enduring. We wanted to stop loved ones from starving. We wanted to cure them when they took sick. We wanted to ensure that their lives would not be ruined by brute force and domination. And from these impulses, steady, enduring impulses, have come the characteristic achievements of our species as a whole: agriculture, medicine, science, technology, and one of our most important achievements, although most despised, modern politics. With these tools, ceaselessly employed or developed, never perfected, human beings have lengthened our lifespan, increased our prosperity, and overthrown a lot of tyrants. To claim this is not to ignore that there are other impulses in us, impulses like the drive to dominate others, bend them to our will, the lust for power, and these have often battled against the impulse to reduce suffering. And the struggle between these impulses has swayed back and forward. But when the better angels of our nature do win out, as they have done, we have advanced. And when we have advanced, it's often to make us aware of the injustices and cruelties that still need to be conquered. This is the story of civilization replacing barbarism, of commerce producing civility and moderation, of science replacing ignorance, that we take from the great Scottish historians. You think of Adam Smith as a economist, but he's also one of the greatest historians. You think of Adam Ferguson, his colleague, Robertson, these wonderful historians in Edinburgh and Glasgow in the last quarter of the 18th century. These are the first people to put this idea together and give us this sense that history proceeds through these stages. And from that Scottish Enlightenment heritage, it was taken up then by some of the great French historians, beginning with the Marquis de Condorcet and then Constant, Michelet, Guizot. Don't need to remember the names, but the point is there's a fantastic late 18th century, mid 19th century tradition of historians who actually dare to think that human history has this shape, has this progressive shape. And one of the figures who belongs to this story is Karl Marx. Karl Marx is, in fact, the heir of this great tradition in which he takes Scottish and French accounts of progress and turns them into a vision of human liberation through revolution, with, as we know, some catastrophic results. But never forget his brilliance and genius as a historian of progress. These heroic attempts to make sense of history mock the kind of facile contemporary pessimism that we see around us. This pessimism that says that history has gone crazy. It's all too hard to understand. What's wonderful about these 18th century and 19th century guys, and they were mostly guys, is they thought it was possible to understand the shape of human time. And it's a magnificent achievement. They did not shrink from the difficulties of simply asking the question we're trying to ask tonight. And we need their ambition because we need to make sense of our own times just as they did. So when I say, let me move to the next phase of my talk to you tonight, which is to talk about how the idea of moral progress makes sense of the times that we have lived. So when I say moral progress makes sense of life, let me give you some examples from my own experience, my own generation. People of my generation in their 60s and 70s, some of you who are here tonight. When I was an adolescent, and you'll remember this too, there were still segregated washrooms in American states. Blacks were still denied the vote and equal protection of the laws in many American states. Homosexual attraction was the love that dared not speak its name. There were racial quotas in immigration that made most immigration in the United States white, essentially, until 1965. Half of the world was still under communist tyranny. Freedom of speech, press, and religion were forbidden. People went to jail for their convictions in about half of the world. In China, let's remember, in 1960, the country was staggering through the starvation and chaos of the Great Leap Forward. There simply is no other word but progress to describe the world as traveled in my lifetime. The age of empire is over. Millions of people rule themselves. They may rule themselves pretty badly, but they rule themselves. They're free from foreign domination. The Soviet Empire is no more. China is a single-party tyranny, but today, in 2015, it's delivering prosperity and limited freedom for millions of human beings for the first time. The racial and ethnic immigration quotas have disappeared, and now we've looked at, in 15 global cities around the world, we're living the first experiment in human history in full multicultural living together with difference, drawing in every race, religion, and creed. These are what I mean by progress. And we've lived since 1945 in a period of nuclear deterrence, which has prevented major war between states. Nuclear weapons don't count in anybody's definition of progress, but the peace that it has secured does. Independence from empire did lead to a horrible increase in civil war, but deaths from intrastate conflict are now declining, and that suggests that state order is consolidating in most of the ex-colonial world. The order that has resulted in our world is certainly still full of cruelty and injustice, but who wants to bring back the age of empire? If you look in other indices in the fields of public health, child mortality has fallen steadily since 1960. There are diseases like ringworm diseases, scourges like polio, which are close to eradication. Millions of people around the world can expect now to live entire lives without knowing the pain and hunger and misery of losing their loved ones to preventable diseases. Some of this progress is simply the result of the application of science and technology. Some of it's an unintended consequence of economic growth. But the stuff that is most powerful to me is the sense in which the crucial dynamic has been the mobilizing force of moral ideas. The ideas that men and women are equal, that girls need to be educated just like boys, the idea that racial discrimination is wrong, the idea that human beings have rights, the idea that no one has a right by nature of their race or history to rule another, the idea that all peoples have a right to rule themselves. Ideas of this sort really have changed the world for the better. And basic human equality is now the default setting of the international system, and it's also the default setting of private morality, even though none of us live fully and consistently with the ideal of human equality. So that's what we would say when we look at the world we've lived since 1960. We can see such evident signs of progress. But for progress to be credible, we have to remember also that progress is dialectical. I mean, in the same year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is proclaimed, in 1948, which is a great advance in human history, that's the same year that apartheid was established as a system of rule in South Africa. So it's not continuous. It doesn't all advance in the same direction. Sometimes a step forward is followed immediately by a step back. Progress advances by disgracing some forms of exclusion, but only to allow or even promote the emergence of new forms. Racial exclusion has been disgraced at precisely the time when new exclusions based on wealth have received moral validation as the just desert of effort and skill. So this sense of it being dialectical is extremely important to hold in mind. We can call the abolition of the slave trade and slavery as possibly the most transformative instance of human progress in history, without being blind to the irony that the free labor that replaced slavery for many American blacks was freedom only in name. And to this day, forms of slavery and indentured servitude still endure. So moral progress is dialectical. Moral progress is also ironic. Sometimes we can only see the cruelties and injustices of our own time, not those that we're about to hand off to the future. One example of this, in a way, is Thomas Jefferson. When he proclaimed that all men were created equal, as everybody knows, he had no idea, no conception that this could apply to the people working on his own estate. But once the premise of human equality is let loose in the world, those like Jefferson, who assumed it could only mean white propertied males, soon discover that poor working men, then women, then blacks, then colonial peoples, then all of mankind began to insist that that original message of 1776 was meant for all of them. In every one of these advances, moral progress is anything but inevitable and anything but automatic. It was the result of struggle, political struggle whose outcomes could never be predicted in advance. And progress does not preclude tragedy. It took the Holocaust to disgrace the pseudo-Darwinian racism of the 19th century. It took total catastrophe for us to understand we never do that again. To say that tragedy is intrinsic to progress is then to say, as I say, that progress is not linear but stochastic, nor is it continuous. It may take 2 steps forward, followed by a step back. And it also precludes the idea that human striving ever has a finality or an end. We never get to the destination if you're committed to the idea of progress. Recurrently, we proclaim the end of history only to discover that history is without endings, happy or otherwise. So why has it become so hard in the 21st century, especially after 9/11, but at all times, to actually believe, to have faith that we're making progress. One of the paradoxes of progress is that progress leaves us unmoved. The more progress we make, for example, lowering infant mortality, the more unacceptable remains the quotient of infant suffering that still remains. If you've just lost your child, you don't care what the statistics of reduced infant mortality are before. All you know and care about is the death of your child. And progress will mean nothing to you in that context. But the thing to bear in mind is that the dialectic of insatiability is what drives progress, and it leaves us unsatisfied with any result that we achieve. Each victory raises the bar of moral expectation, and it makes us less accepting of the suffering that remains. A second reason why we don't derive satisfaction from progress is, I think, has to do with what the psychologists call the, quote, availability heuristic. The suffering we see counts much more than the suffering that's been abolished or prevented. And modern media reinforces that tendency by following the rule, if it bleeds, it leads. And so that, for example, a pungent example, one incident of police brutality in a place like Chicago or nearby Ferguson, one incident of police brutality can make you think that we've made no progress at all in the last 50 years. But in fact, it is possible to think that what happened in Ferguson and Chicago is utterly unacceptable and believe at the same time things are better than they were 50, 60 years ago. So the modern moral conscience lives in disquiet, unable to reconcile the evidence that the world is actually less violent and unjust than it was with a palpable scandal of the violence and injustice that remains. But it is this troubled conscience that needs to be seen as the very motor of moral progress itself. Every victory against exclusion and suffering raises moral standards, increases impatience with the suffering that remains, and increases the psychological salience of the suffering that must be beaten back. This is why, despite all the evidence that we have made progress, we live in a faithless and unconfident moral universe, worried that the forces of hatred and violence may be gaining on us and the zones of danger edging closer. So at this point, you may think, what good is this idea of progress if it isn't consoling or reassuring? What good can it do? Shouldn't we just get on with our lives without thinking these big, difficult, dark, and imponderable thoughts? I'd say this to you. Progress offers us no guarantees that history is going to turn out well. It doesn't actually promise us anything, if we're honest. But it does remind us that others have fought in the past to get us where we are, and we should keep faith with them as we fight our way into the future. Progress understood in this way does not offer consolation, but it does provide us with meaning, a way of understanding our lives as a tiny contribution to a story that began before we were born and will continue long after we are dead and forgotten. And that sense of seeing ourselves in historical time is, I think, immensely important. I want to refer to just a phrase by the philosopher Karl Popper. Because Karl Popper said this. He said that optimism is a moral duty. And I wanted to conclude having us think what that could possibly mean. I think what Karl Popper wanted to say is that without an idea of progress, optimism is mere hopefulness. Optimism only makes sense as a duty if history makes sense as progress. And the duty we have is to promote the belief among those we love that any effort to reduce suffering and widen the circle of inclusion is never a waste of time. Our individual efforts may appear insignificant, but they acquire meaning in the larger context of the human story. Without some belief that humans in general have made progress, humans in particular may easily succumb to despair. We take our motivations, after all, not just from our contemporaries, not just from those we love, but from those forebears whose stubbornness, vision, and courage have bequeathed to us the achievements we so often take for granted. And the idea of progress tells us that we have good reason to keep faith in the future, and that we betray those who went before us, as well as ourselves, if we succumb to the pessimism, doubt, and despair that is so fashionable in current times. Thank you for your attention. Now I understand we have some questions. A question is a short interrogative statement followed by a question mark. Not a lot of people know that, but I thought that might be helpful. Please.
Yes, please.
I have a question. Say that progress comes from technology making it easier for us to choose virtues over vices.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think in the absence of technology, progress is mostly lost, or do you think it's actually had some enduring good effect?
Good question. I think moral progress is not technology dependent. That is, it can happen without technology. Technology has been an enabler. It has been I think, a necessary but not a sufficient condition, which means I'm not a technological determinist. I think that some of the moral ideas that human beings are equal, that men and women are equal, that came from a myriad of sources, and they preceded a lot of the technological advance. This moral set of ideas then powered some of the ways in which we made then technology available. We didn't think we wanted to keep technology in the hands of the rich. It then spread everywhere. And some of the technologies, the Gutenberg Revolution, great technology, printing. I imagine when that technology is invented, the monks and the bishops and the priests, no disrespect, think they can keep it to themselves. It then has a powerful egalitarian effect because it spreads the gospel to the people. So there is a case where technology powers an idea of the community and equality of the faithful, but also accelerates it hugely. And it's that kind of dynamic between moral ideas and technology that I'm trying to unpick. Thank you for the question.
It seems like a lot of the examples of amoral behavior tend to come from power structures. So my question would be, is it possible to create a moral power structure?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I think the name we give to a moral power structure is democracy. I mean, that's the ideal. Democracy is not just simply a system of rule. It's serving a moral purpose. And the moral purpose is everyone counts for one and no one counts for more than one. That's the moral ideal. The reason we have an attachment to democracy is this connection to the moral ideal. Now then, but the question is, we then know, and you know, and I know, and everybody in this room knows, how short of the ideal our democracy actually is. Democracy then gets captured, elite capture, money takes over. Bob Dylan famously said, money doesn't talk, it screams, and it's screaming in the political system of this country and even in my country, the perfect country. That's what's great about being a Canadian. We're just perfect in every regard. No, look, we've all got this struggle to make a system of rule that serves a moral purpose. And part of the reason we care about democracy so much at the moment is we feel it's gone way away from those moral purposes. And the key moral purpose is everyone counts for one and no one counts for more than one.
Assuming that we're making moral progress, it's nice to know maybe that there's a reason for it. Optimism by Karl Popper may be part of the reason. Do you think there are other processes or mechanisms or ideas that we can promote that would make us have better moral progress?
Better ideas. I think sometimes we don't need to promote new ideas, to simply remind ourselves of the good ones that have worked. I just said everyone counts for one and no one counts for more than one. Recovering that sense that democracy is not just a process, a procedure, a set of institutions, but incarnates that value is just incredibly important. It's what I do when I get in my classroom. I try and make people understand that this system incarnates certain values that are always in danger, always at risk. And then I think the second thing about that I was trying to say is to have faith and to teach others to have faith that it has been a steady and enduring human purpose to reduce avoidable suffering. And it has been a steady and enduring purpose, at least since the 18th century, to widen the circle of human inclusion. And the battle is not over, and the battle is still being fought in our own time. But those having a sense that politics should be connected to those enduring purposes, having a sense that your personal life should be connected to those enduring purposes, and having a sense that those purposes are not just picked at random, that they are what human beings have been doing for millennia, is kind of what I think the idea of moral progress is trying to express. And then, perhaps the final thing, history is all very well, but it is made by human beings. It is made by what they do. This is not a spectator sport. There is a crucial requirement in all of us to serve those purposes in some, even in a very humble way, and many of you do, I know.
I was just wondering if we kind of think back to Book 8, I think, of the Republic, where Plato is discussing the fall from the just city down to democracy, down to oligarchy, down to democracy, and then down finally to tyranny. And he's discussing about how we initially make that fall from a just city down the further steps. And what he discusses is sort of the fact that we lose a sense of how to educate. We stop educating the children, specifically at the gold and silver types, but we stop educating them about how to be just. Do you think in some way that moral progress, if it's not contingent upon technology, is contingent upon education?
Yes, no question. When Professor Bailey was introducing me, I had a sense of horror at how scattered and incoherent my life has actually been. But
that wasn't the aim.
If there was a core there, it was teaching and learning and education. And of all the roles that I've occupied in my life, it's the one that seems most meaningful for precisely the reason that you're saying. And I think a teacher who has a sense that the vocation of education is connected to the very fate of the Republic, which is what Plato wants you to grasp, that's absolutely right. There's no question. I don't want to overdo it or overstate it, but I do feel everyone who's a teacher in this university is in the business of teaching citizens and trying to make us better citizens. I just think there's no question that if you don't do that well and don't do that right, the Republic will be in peril.
Jonathan?
I'd like to also thank you for your reminder of this urgent question. As you were speaking, what came to mind for me as a historian was that the age of progress, the epic of progress you lay out, has also been an epic of abundant, maybe overabundant natural resources and climatological stability. Perhaps the question may be better phrased, or maybe a better phrasing of the question would be, what is the fate of moral progress in an age of climatological instability and resource scarcity, the one we may be actually heading into?
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful question, and I think of all the challenges we face, it's the one that poses the most difficult moral questions, because and they're new questions for us. There's always been, I mean, in the Christian tradition and other religious traditions, there's always been a sense of stewardship of the earth. There's always been a sense that the world is God's gift to us, and we have duties towards nature. I think the science of ecology and the environment has given a lot of us suddenly a sense of a global responsibility. We simply didn't, when I think about what's changed in my own mental furniture, growing up, being educated in Canada in the 1960s, we had a sense of nature conservancy. Did we have a sense of the environment? Did we have a sense of the global climatological system? No, absolutely not. So I guess what I'm saying is there is a way of looking at the environmental challenge which makes you exceedingly misanthropic. You just look at what we've done to God's creation and feel a sense of, it's very easy to feel hateful towards the human race. It's easy to feel deeply pessimistic about our chances of doing anything about it. I guess I see it differently. I see that we have a consciousness of this problem we've never had historically. And that's the beginning of the solution. I don't want to whistle past the graveyard here. We are in serious trouble. But I just do think when I look at my colleagues working on these issues, just looking at the scientists that I work with, and look at, as a former politician, look at the salience of this issue in the public's mind, and the beginnings of a willingness to pay certain of the prices that will have to be paid to get some fix on this. I think you can say we've made some progress since 1970. I won't go more than that. The problem, however, is that the vectors of warming and the vectors of damage are possibly moving faster than our capacity to act politically. A story of progress is only plausible if the political reaction is in some sync to the natural indices that we're worried about. And at the moment, everyone, and we all think this, that they're not in sync. And that seems to me the challenge. But I don't think the right way to think about the environmental problem is to start going into misanthropy. All we've got is us. All we've got is our science and our smarts. So let's just not succumb to misanthropy and put our faith in knowledge, in reason, and collective action. It's all we've ever had.
Solar panels, a lot of solar panels. A lot of solar panels.
Yeah, a lot of solar power.
Thank you.
I'm still trembling at the magnificence of your presentation to us tonight. I could ask many questions, but I want to help you to heighten what is really at stake. What is at stake if we lose our faith and belief in progress? There must be some set of words. One word I've always thought as the opposite of progress is regression. But maybe you have, and I suspect you can do a much better job than I can, but there's a powerful lot at stake if we do lose our belief. What is at stake?
Well, I think it's despair. I mean, I think despair is a political problem. I think pessimism is a political problem. A political problem in the sense that if you have political systems that start generating lots of public belief that our problems are just too hard to solve, that our system is so jammed up we can't fix it, that the partisanship is so great we can't find common solutions. There's a lot of pessimism out there and there's some good evidence for the pessimism. But that's why, and I am not going to propose a solution to some of the institutional difficulties that are besetting your republic at the moment. I've said enough foolish things tonight to last a lifetime. But I think that's the point about, let's stand back here. That's what I'm saying. Let's stand back. Let's look at how far we've come. Let's look at the things we have accomplished. You know, I came through Kansas City Airport this morning at 11 o'clock, and I just passed on my way to the flight here one of those Rotary Club things. Some of you may have something to do with Rotary, but Rotary has spent 60 years trying to eradicate polio. Everybody knows that story. I'm not a Rotarian, right? But it's just, if you look, you can see a story of progress, and that is a story of progress. There's less polio now than there was. So let's remember these chains of virtue, and that's one example, and there might be countless others, that give us some sense that if we have faith in human reason, in the human capacity to do things together, we can fix the problems that we face. Because the alternative, what is the alternative progress? The alternative is simply despair, pessimism, fatalism, and sitting on your couch waiting for the end to come. And that just isn't what human beings have done ever. And so we're not going to do it now. That's kind of what I'm saying. So and I'm also saying this point about it being a duty. I think we do have some duty to remind ourselves of where we've come from. And we've got a duty to remind others of where we've come from and how much we can do together. That's why I ended with optimism as a moral duty. Thank you for the question. I think I'm going to take one more, and then before I start talking total nonsense, I'm going to stop. Sir.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's been awesome. Economist Joseph Stiglitz discusses in his book The Rise of Inequality, and I'm just wondering whether you consider this inequality moral decline.
Mm-hmm. I think the inequality is worrying for the moral reason that it's damaging our democracy. And I think we need to think straight about why inequality is a problem. I think inequality is a problem chiefly not because of the distance between the richest and the poorest, not the extraordinary, sometimes grotesque wealth of the top 1 or 0.5%. The sheer fact that they have so much money actually doesn't bother me morally. What bothers me morally and politically is the power that it confers to affect democratic outcomes, the power that it gives them to game regulatory processes, the power that it gives the very, very rich to basically determine democratic outcomes before the rest of us have had our voice. That bothers me intensely because of the moral stake I have that everybody should count for one and no one should count for more than one. It's the moral heart of the democratic experiment. So I'm not worried about great wealth in itself. Some people are, but I am not. What I'm worried about is the political consequences of wealth and the need, therefore, to tax it fairly. It also irritates me, just as a citizen, to pick up the newspaper as I did today and discover that the Obama administration has outlawed a merger between two huge pharmaceutical companies, simply because those pharmaceutical companies wanted to merge and go to Ireland and evade U.S. corporate tax. And you think to yourself, you know, if this is a republic of citizens, everybody has to pay their fair share. I don't believe in punitive taxation of corporations. I understand who creates the jobs. I get all that. But you want a fair system in which everybody pays their way, because otherwise the roads don't get repaired and the schools don't get funded and the universities can't do their research and Social Security can't get funded and all that stuff. You know, that's where I have an issue. It's the political consequences of great wealth, not the fact that there's a big disparity. And I also, let me add something else. I think what worries everybody about the current situation in the United States, but not just in the United States, in my country and other places, is that there are a lot of people being left behind, a lot of people who just can't. The economy is not generating decent paid jobs that allow people to live in dignity and freedom, and that's a problem. And these are the big issues. And they're moral issues in the sense that you can't run a republic of citizens if a lot of citizens feel the game is over before they start playing it. You know, that's bothering a lot of people. And you can see it in the election. And at this point, as a Canadian, I'm stepping back out. I just stepped in there and don't want to overstay my welcome, but can I thank you for your attention? It's been wonderful to talk.